There's a number that should not exist. It lives inside a column of wartime records buried in the archives of the U.S. Army's Tank Destroyer Force. And when analysts finally tallied it after the war was over, they sat with it for a long time before they believed it. 2.4 to 1. That was a kill-to-loss ratio of a vehicle weighing 20 tons, clad in armor thinner than the side of a filing cabinet, powered by an aircraft engine that had no business being bolted into anything that rolled on the ground, and crewed by 5 men sitting in an open-top steel box exposed to the rain, the cold, the shrapnel, and any German soldier with a rifle above the tree line. For every Hellcat lost in Europe, its crews destroyed 2.4 enemy armored vehicles. No other American armored fighting vehicle in the entire war came close. Not the Sherman, not the M10, not the M36 with its fearsome 90mm gun, the machine that everyone said was too fragile, too lightly armed, and too nakedly vulnerable finished the war with the best killing record on the Allied side of the ledger. The math genuinely doesn't work. Unless you understand something the engineers almost missed, something the generals took too long to appreciate, and something the German Panzer crews discovered, at catastrophic personal cost, on a foggy hillside in northeastern France in September of 1944. Speed, it turns out, is a kind of armor, just not the kind that stops bullets. The idea began with a problem that haunted American military planners throughout the late 1930s. They had watched Germany's armored columns tear through Poland, through the Low Countries, through France, and the lesson seemed clear enough. Mass tanks could crack any defensive line if they moved fast enough and concentrated their force in the right place at the right time. The question was how to stop them. The obvious answer was more tanks, bigger guns, thicker steel. The answer that Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce kept coming back to was something different entirely. Bruce was an unusual kind of military thinker. When he assumed command of the Tank Destroyer Tactical and Firing Center at Fort Meade in November 1941, he carried with him a conviction that had made him unpopular in certain corners of the War Department. The best counter to a heavily armored enemy tank was not a vehicle that tried to out-armor it, but one that could outmove it. He used a naval analogy that his subordinates heard so often they could recite it from memory. He didn't want a battleship. He wanted a cruiser. Fast, lethal, expendable, a weapon that survived not by absorbing punishment, but by refusing to be where the punishment landed. The early attempts to build this machine were embarrassing. The M6 was a 37mm anti-tank gun strapped to a modified light truck, and it wilted against anything heavier than a Panzer II. The M3 half-track mounting a 75mm howitzer was only slightly less humiliating. The M10, built on the Sherman chassis, was a reliable vehicle with real stopping power, but it weighed 30 tons and its top speed on a good road was 25 miles per hour. Bruce looked at the M10 and saw exactly what he didn't want. It was simply a lighter tank, and a lighter tank was not a cruiser. It was just a slower battleship. What he needed had to be built from scratch, and the answer came from an unlikely place. The design studio of the Buick Motor Division of General Motors in Flint, Michigan, where a man named Harley Earl presided over one of the most creative engineering teams in America. Earl was famous for designing the sweeping chrome-laden automobiles of the post-war era, but in the early 1940s, he was turning his team's energy toward a very different kind of machine. The vehicle that emerged from his studio was the T-70, and when the Army drove the first prototype in the spring of 1943, the reaction was one of stunned, slightly disbelieving admiration. It weighed 20 tons. It carried a 9-cylinder, 400-horsepower Continental R 975 radial engine, the same air-cooled aircraft power plant found in the Sherman, but made it here to a lighter, purpose-built hull that used every gram of that power differently. The suspension was a torsion bar system of Buick's own design, smooth enough that the vehicle could maintain useful speeds over rough ground that would have beaten the teeth out of Sherman crew. The transmission was a 900T Torquematic, 3 forward ranges, with a top gear that allowed cruising speeds between 30 and 60 miles per hour. On paved roads, under controlled conditions, test drivers pushed the T-70 to speeds that strained credibility, 55 miles an hour, sometimes touching 60 on a banked oval at the General Motors Proving Ground in Milford, 60 miles an hour, in something that weighed 20 tons, faster than some Army trucks, faster than any other tracked armored fighting vehicle fielded by any nation in the entire war. But Bruce's vision demanded a price, and it was paid in steel. The armor on the T-70, standardized in March 1944 as the M18 and immediately nicknamed the Hellcat by the men at Buick who built it, was not armor in any meaningful protective sense. The hull sides were 12.7 millimeters thick, half an inch. The floor was barely a quarter-inch plate. The turret front, the strongest point on the vehicle, topped out at 25 millimeters, 1 inch, on the cast gun mantlet. For context, the M8 armored car, a vehicle everyone understood to be essentially a scouting truck with a gun bolted on, wore more steel than the Hellcat's hull sides. 9 out of 30 armor-piercing .30 caliber rifle bullets, fired from a range of 75 yards at the turret during testing, punched straight through. When Army evaluators presented these figures to commanders in England in early 1944, General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st Army, simply refused the vehicle. He had M10s, and his soldiers knew how to use them. If they were going to die in a lightly armored box, he wanted it to be a box with a better gun than the Hellcat's 76mm cannon, which ordnance testing suggested would struggle to penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther tank at ranges beyond 300 yards. 300 yards. In a tank engagement, 300 yards was the distance at which a Panther's long-barrel 75 could put a round through a Sherman's front plate with comfortable reliability. And it could do the same thing to a Hellcat so fast that the crew might not even know they were being targeted until the round was already inside the hull. So 3 battalions of Hellcats, the 603rd, the 704th, and the 705th, went instead to the 3rd Army, to General George Patton, who read the specifications and saw something Bradley apparently didn't. Patton understood speed the way other generals understood firepower. He understood it as a force multiplier, a psychological weapon, a method of generating chaos in the enemy's mind faster than the enemy could resolve it. He looked at a vehicle that could travel at 55 miles per hour across a European road net and thought not about what it couldn't do against a Tiger's frontal plate, but about where it could be and when. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion was the first American unit to test a Hellcat in formal Army trials, and the relationship they developed with the vehicle was intimate and iterative. They trained hard, drove a machine to its limits, and sent back an unbroken stream of observations and recommendations that Buick's engineers actually incorporated into production models. When the battalion landed in Normandy in the summer of 1944 and began following Patton's spearhead across France at a pace that left German logistics officers staring at their maps in disbelief, they had already spent months learning the Hellcat's character, its strengths, its narrow margins, and the specific conditions under which it killed. Those conditions were not the ones written in the doctrine manuals. On paper, the tank destroyer force was supposed to mass in battalion strength and meet German armored thrusts on favorable ground, using coordinated fire to swamp enemy tanks with volume. In practice, the Hellcat units almost never operated that way. They were parceled out to infantry and combined arms units, used for infantry support, for convoy escort, for clearing pillboxes in French villages, for all the unglamorous maintenance work an army advancing faster than its supply lines. The proper massed anti-armor battle that Andrew Bruce had designed the vehicle for kept not happening because the German Panzer counteroffensives that Bruce had expected were also not materializing. Not yet, anyway. And American commanders kept finding other uses for the fastest tracked vehicle in the theater. By mid-September 1944, Patton's 3rd Army had pushed 400 miles from a Normandy bridgehead. The 4th Armored Division, Patton's preferred spearhead, had crossed the Moselle River south of Nancy and was pushing northeast toward the German border with momentum that alarmed Hitler's headquarters enough to order an immediate counterattack. The man tasked with organizing was General Otto von Manchefeld, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, and the forces assigned to him were built around 2 newly formed Panzer brigades, the 111th and the 113th, equipped with Panther tanks and Panzer Grenadiers, sent to combat with training that the brigade's own senior officers described in post-battle reports with barely concealed contempt. They had not been trained as combined arms units. They had no artillery of their own. Their radio equipment was inadequate, and their reconnaissance, before the attack at Arracourt, was essentially non-existent. Manchefeld himself was deeply skeptical that the attack would succeed. But Hitler wanted results, And Hitler wanted them now. And so on the morning of September 19th, 1944, the Panthers rolled west out of their assembly areas into ground fog so thick that visibility dropped below 100 yards, and the battle that neither side had fully prepared for began. The terrain around the town of Arracourt was agricultural Lorraine, gently rolling hills with scattered stands of hardwood, farmland divided by hedgerows and sunken lanes, the kind of country where a vehicle that crested a rise too quickly might not see the gun waiting for it in the next suppression until the muzzle flash was already in front of its face. Colonel Bruce Clark's Combat Command A of the 4th Armored had its headquarters at the Rieuville Farm, east of Arracourt. Guarding the headquarters was a platoon of Hellcats from Company C of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, 2 battalions of self-propelled 105mm guns, and a regiment of towed 155mm artillery pieces. The rest of CCA was spread across a frontage of several miles, thinned further because a substantial chunk of its strength had been detached the day before to help mop up fighting at Lunéville. At 7:45 in the morning, Captain William Dwight, the 37th Tank Battalion's liaison officer, received orders from Clark to take a platoon of tank destroyers and establish a blocking position on Hill 246, approximately 800 yards from the village of Réchicourt-la-Petite. For M18s, commanded by Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, ground up the slope and deployed. What happened next occupied less than 5 minutes. And in those 5 minutes, the character of the entire day's battle was announced. A German tank materialized out of the fog at the base of the hill. It was close. Close enough that Leiper's platoon could see the rain slick on the hull before they had time to register exactly what they were looking at. Sergeant Stacy's Hellcat fired first. The round hit. A second tank appeared, and Stacy destroyed it as well, the shell finding its mark before the German crew had time to locate the source of the fire. Then a German round came back out of the fog and hit Stacy's vehicle, wounding the crew but leaving it still mobile. Another Hellcat shot the Panzer for that had fired on Stacy. 2 more German tanks tried to reverse back into the woodline and were caught and destroyed as they turned. This was already something strange. The Hellcats had arrived, deployed, and begun killing in the time it took a Panther crew to fully understand that they were under fire. Leiper pulled his 3 remaining operational Hellcats to a neighboring height, and from there he spotted something that changed the texture of the morning. A column of German tanks moving along a sunken road between Réchicourt and Bézange-la-Petite. His crews opened fire down the length of the column, and then called in artillery from the M7 105mm guns positioned to the rear. The combination of direct fire and artillery destroyed 5 Panzer IVs in the road before the column could disperse. The fog was still thick, and it was working in 2 different directions simultaneously. For the Germans, it had concealed their approach. They had been able to push Panther tanks to within 30 feet of Leiper's platoon before being seen, an extraordinary tactical advantage that their training and reconnaissance failures converted immediately into catastrophe, because they had no coherent plan for what to do once contact was made. For the Hellcat crews, the fog stripped away the one scenario in which their thin armor and inadequate frontal penetration genuinely mattered. The long-range engagement, where a Panther could sit behind its 80mm glassy plate at 1,500 yards and methodically destroy everything in front of it without ever allowing anything to close the range. In the fog, there was no 1,500 yards. There was only the immediate distance, the fast decision, and the vehicle that could move first. The Hellcat could always move first. Here is a mechanical reality that no training manual adequately captured, and that German tankers had to learn through accumulated wreckage. The Panther's turret required somewhere between 15 and 25 seconds to traverse 90 degrees when using its power traversal system, and significantly longer if the vehicle was on any kind of slope or the system was underperforming. The Hellcat's turret could rotate a full 360 degrees in 24 seconds on flat ground. That difference, measured in seconds, was the margin between life and death in the fog of Lorraine. A Hellcat that fired, moved laterally at 30 or 40 miles per hour across broken ground, and reappeared at a new angle 60 seconds later, was not the same target the Panther's gunner had been trying to track. It was a new threat, arriving from a new direction, demanding the entire aiming solution be recalculated while the Hellcat's crew already had their sights on the Panther's flank. This was a philosophy that the Hellcat's designers had built into every gram of the machine, and that the 704th's crews had spent months internalizing. They called it shoot and scoot, a phrase simple enough for a training slogan but profound enough to carry an entire tactical doctrine. Fire, relocate. Fire from a new position, relocate again. Never sit still long enough to become a target. Never fight on the enemy's terms. The Hellcat could not afford a direct exchange with the Panther on equal ground at equal range. That fight ended in seconds, and it ended badly for the American crew. But the Hellcat was never supposed to fight on equal ground. It was supposed to find the unequal ground, the oblique angle, the moment when a tank column was committed to a direction, and a Hellcat appeared from the side where the armor was thinner and the turret rotation couldn't keep up. By mid-morning on September 19th, as the battle around Arracourt developed into something larger and more violent than either side had anticipated, Sergeant Henry Hartman of Company C's platoon found himself at the center of the day's most concentrated killing. Hartman was not a spectacular man in any visible sense. He was a tank commander doing the job he had trained for, reading terrain, managing his crew, making the rapid assessments that the situation demanded. But on this particular morning, in this particular fog, Hartman's Hellcat found its angles again and again. 6 German tanks. He knocked out 6 of them, most of which were Panthers, the most formidable medium tank Germany produced in the war. 6 Panthers that outweighed his vehicle by 30 tons each, that carried frontal armor his gun couldn't reliably penetrate face-on, that were crewed by men who in many cases had more combat hours in armored vehicles than Hartman's entire platoon combined. 6 of them. In a single engagement, on a single foggy morning in France. The Panther 75mm gun, firing at ranges where it could see, was arguably the finest tank gun fielded by either side in Normandy and Lorraine. Its velocity was devastating, its penetration exceptional, its accuracy at long range superb. But a target moving at 40 miles per hour across its field of view, popping over a ridgeline for 12 seconds, firing, and disappearing back into dead ground before the Panther's gunner could complete the manual traversal. That target presented a problem that the Panther's designers had not engineered a solution for. The gun was built for a world where the enemy held still long enough to be aimed at. The Hellcat made that world impossible. There was also something else the Hellcat's crews discovered in those first weeks of heavy combat. A piece of practical knowledge that the ordnance manuals had never mentioned because no one at the test range had been thinking tactically when they evaluated the vehicle's firepower against specific German armor. The Panther's frontal glacis was 80mm of sloped steel, and from the front, the Hellcat's 76mm round at standard ranges simply deflected or shattered its cap without penetrating, but between the gun mantlet and the top of the glacis plate, where they met in an irregular joint. There was a gap in the geometry of the Panther protection, a place where the angles didn't quite line up into the impenetrable compound slope that made the rest of the front so lethal to attack. A round placed precisely in that junction didn't need to penetrate. It ricocheted. It ricocheted downward into the driving compartment. And what happened inside a tank when a 76mm round went off in the driving compartment was not something that left survivors. Word of this discovery traveled through Hellcat units faster than any training circular. It wasn't written in a manual. It was communicated the way useful knowledge always moved in combat, through after-action conversations, through radio chatter between Hellcat commanders, through the simple fact that crews who survived were the ones who adapted, and the ones who adapted told each other what worked. By the time the battle around Arracourt reached its 3rd and 4th days, the 704th's crews were shooting at Panther weaknesses with a deliberate precision that went well beyond the doctrine they had been issued. By late afternoon on September 19th, as German forces pushed toward the 4th Armored's command post itself, Captain Tom Evans directed his 3 platoons of Hellcats in a coordinated maneuver that became the signature action of the day and one of the more tactically elegant small unit engagements of the entire campaign. A German column of tanks was approaching along the road toward Arracourt. Evans positioned his lead platoon as a visible, attractive target. Not to destroy the German column, but to fix its attention, to pull its eyes and its guns forward while the other 2 platoons swung wide on both flanks. The Germans took the bait. They pressed forward against Evans's lead element, and they were still adjusting their fire and advancing when the flanking platoons appeared from the sides, already at the angles where Panther armor was thinnest and the shooting was simplest. 19 German tanks burned on the approaches to Arracourt that day. 19. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had rolled into the attack that morning with vehicles and momentum in numbers, withdrew toward Moncourt having lost 43 tanks, mostly Panthers, and roughly 200 infantry. The American losses for the entire day were 5 Shermans, 3 Hellcats, and 6 men killed. But Captain Evans's day was not finished. At some point during the afternoon fighting, one of his M18s was disabled by a German round. Immobilized, unable to move, but structurally intact, Evans climbed into the disabled vehicle's turret himself and stayed in it, using the gun, directing his aim by eye, and knocked out 2 more Panthers before the fighting around the command post subsided. For that, he received the Distinguished Service Cross. But the men who were there that day always said the medal didn't fully capture what they had witnessed. A man choosing to sit in a dead vehicle in the middle of an active tank battle, surrounded by Panthers that could kill him through the hull from any direction, because the gun still worked and there were targets in range. The battle for Arracourt continued for another 10 days, with the 5th Panzer Army throwing additional formations at the 4th Armored in a series of diminishing assaults that stripped the Wehrmacht's offensive capacity in Lorraine down to almost nothing. By the time the fighting ended on September 29th, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed 39 German armored fighting vehicles. They had lost 4 M18s destroyed and 3 more damaged. 39 enemy armored vehicles. 4 Hellcats. The numbers sit there with the same stubborn improbability as the overall kill ratio, demanding that you recalculate them, wondering if there's been a clerical error, finding that there hasn't. What those numbers meant at the strategic level was that Otto von Manchefeld's counteroffensive had failed completely. The Panzer brigades he had sent against Patton's spearhead were shattered formations, reduced from nearly 200 tanks to fewer than 60, unable to mount coherent offensive action. The 4th Armored Division's advance toward Germany resumed, and in the after-action reports filed at every level of command, from platoon to corps, the Hellcat speed was identified again and again as a decisive factor. Not its gun, its speed, inside the vehicles themselves. The experience of that week had been brutal and specific, grinding way that close-range armored combat always was. The open turret that headquarters complained about in memoranda, that exposed crew vulnerability to sniper fire, to grenades, to artillery fragments, turned out to be an advantage in the fog-bound terrain around Arracourt in a way that took some explaining. The Hellcat crew could hear. They could hear a Panther engine before they could see the tank. They could hear the direction of incoming fire, feel the air pressure rounds passing close, smell the diesel-exhausted German vehicles working their way through the tree lines. Buttoned up inside a Tiger, a German commander was functionally blind except through narrow vision ports, dependent on his driver's sense of ground and his own narrow cone of observation. In the open Hellcat turret, a crew could look in every direction simultaneously, could whisper to each other without the intercommunication system, could react to a threat appearing at the edge of the fog before it had fully resolved into a tank shape. This was not in any document. It was just what happened when you stripped away enough metal that the world could reach in and tell you things. The cold was also real. By autumn, with the North European winter establishing itself in damp, bone-deep increments, the open turret transformed the Hellcat into what one veteran later described as a large, armor-plated refrigerator on tracks, a description that was not entirely figurative, since the Continental Radial engine's air cooling system pulled outside air through the crew compartment as part of an operating cycle, and sealing the gap completely was mechanically impossible. Crews wrapped themselves in blankets, in spare clothing, in anything that could cut the wind that came to the turret ring at 30 miles an hour on a cross-country movement. They ate cold rations and slept cold in their vehicles, and woke cold to frozen hatches and engines that needed to be coaxed back to life in sub-zero temperatures before the day's fighting could begin. None of this is in the kill ratio. The kill ratio is just numbers. The numbers don't carry the smell of diesel and frost and burnt steel. What came after Arracourt was a battle of the Bulge, and it brought the Hellcat to its second defining moment under a different kind of pressure. When Hitler launched his Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the surprise and speed of the German advance created a crisis that consumed the Allied command structure for days. Units were cut off. Supply lines were overrun. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction in the Belgian Ardennes, became the center of a desperate defense by the 101st Airborne Division, which had been rushed into the area without adequate heavy weapons and found itself surrounded by German forces within days of the offensive's opening. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with M18 Hellcats, was attached to the 101st. Their deployment to Bastogne included one of the very few documented instances in the entire war where the Hellcat's road speed was used at its full, improbable capacity. Team de Sobry, a battalion-sized task force of the 10th Armored Division, was racing to establish a blocking position at the village of Neuville, northeast of Bastogne, ahead of a German armored column that was trying to reach the same road junction first. With 4 M18s from the 705th, the task force made the run to Neuville at 55 miles per hour. They arrived ahead of the Germans, by a margin so slim that the subsequent engagement began before the last vehicles had finished deploying into their fighting positions. But they arrived first, and arriving first was the entire substance of the tank destroyer doctrine, distilled to its essence: be somewhere faster than the enemy expects. At Neuville, the M18s fought in conditions that were nearly the opposite of Arracourt. Low visibility again, but from snow and frozen fog this time, with German forces pressing from multiple directions and the Hellcat crews operating in isolated, outnumbered positions without the artillery coordination that had amplified their effectiveness in Lorraine. The accounts of what happened at Neuville are fragmented, as the accounts of close defensive fighting always are, but the military channel historians who reconstructed the engagement from unit records credited the M18s with 24 kills, including several Tiger tanks, and concluded that their speed, their ability to fire from one position, will locate in seconds and reappear from a different angle before the German commanders had processed the first contact, confuse the German advance, sufficiently to allow the paratroopers to hold the town overnight. On Christmas Day 1944, with the encirclement of Bastogne still ongoing, the 15th Panzer Division attacked positions held by the 101st Airborne. The M18s of the 705th were positioned in direct support of the airborne infantry, and over the course of that day's fighting, they were credited with destroying 27 German tanks. 6 Hellcats were lost. 27 German tanks destroyed. 6 Hellcats lost. Another entry in the ledger of numbers that the math stubbornly refuses to rationalize away. By the time the Ardennes campaign ended in January 1945 and Patton's Third Army completed its relief of Bastogne, and the broader offensive resumed toward the German border, the M18's record was essentially written. It would continue fighting through the Rhineland campaign, through the final advances into Germany, through the vicious close combat of the spring of 1945, when German resistance flared and flared again in a pattern that exhausted everyone on both sides. The 603rd and 704th Tank Destroyer Battalions each finished the war having claimed the destruction of more than 90 enemy armored fighting vehicles. The final tally across all theaters, Europe, Italy, the Pacific, was 526 enemy armored vehicles destroyed. A kill-to-loss ratio of 2.4 to 1, the highest of any American armored vehicle in the war. In the Pacific, the 637th Tank Destroyer Battalion used its Hellcats in the brutal fighting from Manila in early 1945, earning the Presidential Unit Citation for clearing the heavily fortified emplacement of Fort McKinley, where the 76mm gun proved useful not for killing tanks. The Japanese had few, but for the direct fire reduction of concrete fortifications in close-quarters urban combat. The machine that had been designed for a specific doctrinal purpose, massed anti-armor defense against the German blitzkrieg, turned out to be sufficiently versatile and lethal to be useful in whatever context it was placed, which is probably the most honest assessment of any weapon system's success. After the war, the Army retired the Hellcat almost immediately. The tank destroyer doctrine that it produced, it was officially discredited in post-war reviews. Its design philosophy derided as poorly balanced. Its gun acknowledged as inadequate against the frontal armor of late-war German vehicles. Some historians have been blunt about its limitations, noting that the M18's combat record was a testament to the skill and adaptability of its crews rather than the quality of the machine itself. There's truth in that. There's also something slightly ungrateful in it, because the crews who took that machine and extracted a 2.4 kill ratio from it using improvised tactics, discovered vulnerabilities through trial and error, and sometimes manned disabled vehicles in the middle of ongoing tank battles to keep shooting. Those crews would machine, in the way that matters most, Norbert Gerling, who spent the last months of the European War as a Hellcat gunner with the 609th Tank Destroyer Battalion, traveling 1,200 miles across France and into Germany, was in his 90s when he talked about the war. He described using his 10 power scope at Trier to put round after round into the pedestals of a railway overpass, collapsing the structure onto a German anti-tank gun that had been pinning down an American tank crew in a valley below. 7 or 8 rounds, he said. He watched the overpass come down, and the threat was neutralized, and the stranded crew could be recovered. He received a Bronze Star for it. When asked what moment from the war stayed with him most vividly, he didn't talk about the tank-to-tank engagements, the German Tigers, the hedgerow skirmishes. He talked about that bridge and those men. It was nice to be part of a team that helped rescue someone. He said, "You just don't know if what you did might have saved a person's life." This is the other thing that doesn't appear in kill ratios. The rescue that happened because a fast vehicle could reach a position before the enemy could react. The stranded tank crew that survived because something small and quick and lethal had been within range at the right moment. The infantrymen who were still alive because a Hellcat had materialized on a German flank at a speed nobody anticipated and ended an engagement before it could fully develop. The Hellcat's record is full of what it destroyed. It is harder to account for what it saved. The deeper lesson, the one that the M18 teaches with more force than anything in its official specifications, is about the nature of vulnerability in warfare. Every armored vehicle is vulnerable somewhere. The Tiger's weak points were its rear and flanks. The Panthers were its sides and the seam between mantlet and glacis. The M18's was nearly everywhere. Its hull sides, its open turret, its floor, its crew compartment. The entire exposed structure of a vehicle designed to be hit as infrequently as possible rather than survive being hit. The engineers who built it had placed a bet that a vehicle which moved fast enough, precisely enough, and intelligently enough could transform its vulnerability into irrelevance, because you cannot be killed by a gun that cannot track you. In the fog of Lorraine, in the frozen forest roads around Bastogne, in the close rubble-strewn streets of Manila, that bet paid at a rate of 2.4 to 1. Against the Panthers and Tigers and Panzer IVs of the Wehrmacht, against the bunkers and fortifications of Pacific, against everything the war put in front of it, the machine that every logistics officer called underprotected and every ordnance inspector called undergunned turned out to be the most effective tank killer America put into the field. Andrew Bruce had called it cruiser. He had meant a naval vessel. Fast, aggressive, built to strike and withdraw before the battleship's guns could respond. But the men who actually fought in the Hellcat found a better comparison, one that came not from naval doctrine, but from the accumulated experience of driving too fast down foggy French roads with 5 men in a 20-ton machine and a 76mm gun and half an inch of steel between them and everything the German army could throw. They called it Cat. They called it that because cats are not built to absorb punishment. They are built to avoid it. They are built to move, to vanish, to reappear somewhere unexpected, to strike from angles that don't align with where the danger was last seen. They survive not through toughness, but through relentless, precise, intelligent motion. The Germans called the worst days at Arracourt something different. They called them catastrophe. It amounts to the same thing. There are only about a dozen M18 Hellcats still operational in the world today. They appear at tank festivals and museum exhibitions, grinding along at controlled speeds on demonstration courses for crowds who take photographs and read the placards about the specifications. The numbers on those placards, 55 miles per hour, 12 millimeters of armor, 76mm gun, don't convey what the vehicle was. Numbers never quite managed that for any machine that was actually used in anger. To understand what the Hellcat was, you need to understand it as Sergeant Hartman understood it on that foggy hillside on September 19, 1944, as something that moved before the enemy could aim, shot before the enemy could respond, and vanished before the enemy could find it again, as something that turned the German army's most feared tanks into burning steel shapes in the Lorraine farmland, not through superior armor or superior firepower, but through the oldest and least quantifiable advantage available to any combatant in any fight. It got there first. It left before it was found. And it kept doing that until the war was over. If this story has stayed with you, the improbable numbers, the fog, the 5 men in an open turret making the math work, hit that like button, subscribe, because these are the stories that deserve to outlast the textbooks. And leave a comment with a detail that surprised you most. I read every one.